Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm still getting the hang of this and figuring out what kind of videos I want to make and how to make them. But I thought today I would go with something that was a bit of a staple for a Booktube channel, I think, and that would be a book review. And so I wanted to review the book All Systems Red by Martha Wells. I read this book in January and I really enjoyed it, and I thought it would be a lot of fun to review it. All Systems Red is a novella. It is the first book in a series of 4 novellas. The author is Martha Wells. She is the winner of numerous awards, including the Hugo, the Nebula, the Locus. In addition to the beautiful packaging and design of this book, I was also intrigued by the premise of it. I love robot stories. I love AI stories. And so I was already warm to the idea of whatever this book had to offer. The self-named Murderbot is a being who is an amalgamation of human and synthetic parts, a construct, if you will, who hacks its own governing module and grants itself the ability to have autonomy. While guarding a group of scientists that rented it for protection while they explore a new planet to colonize, Murderbot fights its own desire to hide away from the humans and watch soap operas all day in isolation. Rather than let anyone know it's self-aware, Murderbot pretends to mindlessly follow orders and conceal its autonomy. When an alien life form attacks the scientists, Murderbot is suddenly forced to start paying attention, and worse yet, to begin the excruciating task of interacting with humans. When the humans try to ask it questions, include it, and worst of all, treat it like a person, Murderbot must confront its own debilitating social anxiety and stunted tolerance of emotions, all the while trying to solve the mystery of what is trying to kill them. So for my general impressions, the story is extremely character focused rather than plot focused. We are so in the character's head that our view of the world and the story is extremely limited to what Murderbot thinks about the world. And while this could be considered a detriment, one of the biggest things you would criticize about this book is the bare bones quality of the world building and other characters. I think it's also part of what makes the story shine in its strengths as well. All of the time and attention that Wells doesn't give to those elements of the story, instead she gives to the main character, Murderbot. And Murderbot is so well realized because of it. Even the emotionally stunted views of the world around it that the reader may find frustrating at times also serve to give you that much stronger sense of the character and their limitations and weaknesses. But I will say, if you were looking for a richly detailed world-building story or hard sci-fi with lots of technical explanations of things, this book will not scratch that itch. To get the cons out of the way, the world building and side characters are very minimalistic. But the thing that I actually found the weakest point of the story was the plot. It was very straightforward. It lacked foreshadowing or even a feeling of irony. Despite that though, I did actually really enjoy this book. As I mentioned, it is a novella, so Wells had to be very selective about where she placed her focus and attention. What you get in exchange is a fascinating, immersive, and thoroughly enjoyable narrative of this one character. And that seems to make it all worth it. I do recommend this book. If you are looking for a really fun character, if you're looking for a quick, enjoyable read, I think there's a really good chance that you will really love Murderbot as well. And I think this is the sort of book that's fun to read between bigger series when you just want something fresh and it's strange to call it light, but there is a humorous quality to this book that makes it a little lighthearted despite some of the grim topics. As for the nuts and bolts of the writing, it was very well crafted, and the writing felt very seamless. I do think a lot of people would have wanted a little more exposition, if only to get more of a sense of the greater universe outside the main character's head. I think 95% of the time was spent on making an incredibly complex and interesting character instead of world, plot, or side characters. There is a positiveness in that simplicity. One of the words I would use to describe this story is poignant. And I think that poignancy results from the simplicity of that story. And it would lose part of what makes it such a great story if you were to change that balance. But I find myself wishing there was just a little bit more meat on the bones of it. Not that I wanted it to be longer per se, but just a little more full. Perhaps there were ways in which the plot and the world building could have added more nuance and irony to the story without upsetting the heavy character focus. This book is written in first person, a very sarcastic, dry first person at that. I was actually a little nervous when I first picked this book up that it would all just be witty one-liners, no substance, but that was not the case at all. The dark humor and sarcastic tone played pitch perfect for the story, and instead of being the selling point of the character, they actually in some ways were a smokescreen for the more real person underneath. Instead of being the thing that made the character cool, it was the thing that highlighted some of their very real anxieties and struggles as a newly sentient being. The plot is pretty straightforward, and it is more of a stage for us to see the main character maneuver around rather than ever feeling like it had a life of its own. I wouldn't say that the plot was predictable either. We are never really given enough information to guess at the larger world. We are only given the useful information the moment it becomes relevant to the story. So there is sort of a hollowness to the plot because of that. You're just along for the ride. The story never seemed to drag in any areas or belabor anything, and the introspective punctuations in the story felt just right. But this story really isn't about the plot. It's about Murderbot. Which brings me to the next section, characters. Characters, or more precisely character, is where this story shines. Murderbot is a thoroughly captivating character. I was skeptical at first that the cavalier, sarcastic bot would just feel too gimmicky or trying too hard to be cool or edgy, but that ended up not being the case at all. Instead, the sarcastic voice, the emotional aloofness, was juxtaposed against its dysfunctional levels of social anxiety and emotional withdrawal. We see it struggle with what borders on anthrophobia, its pronounced anxiety in the physical presence of humans. Instead of Murderbot just being cheeky and cleverer than everyone, we experience along with it that its sarcasm and aloofness come from a deep-seated inability to allow any feelings of emotional connection with the humans. This is also shown in her strong preference to keep her visor blacked out and not let the humans see her actual face, preferring to remain faceless. This significant weakness of the character contrasts and yet reinforces her sarcastic, emotionally disconnected narration. Wells does a wonderful job of making Murderbot relatable and sympathetic. It bleeds like a person and then crawls off alone to heal, which evoked a very strong desire in me to see her taken care of. There is a bit of a sophomore quality to the character, an emotional level that sometimes feels like a teenager, but this can easily be attributed to the fact that this character is in some ways like a teenager, a young, inexperienced being just now starting to figure out who it is and deal with its place in the world around it. Not only is Murderbot most often suited up in armor with no face to speak of, it also walls itself up in an armor of sarcasm and emotional distance. One thing that is stressed about Murderbot is its preference to hole up alone in its room and binge watch soap operas. While on the surface, this is a relatable laziness most people can identify with, it's also a further symptom of Murderbot's anthrophobia. It's needing to keep several layers of emotional and physical distance from humans. But while it feels a great deal of anxiety around humans, it's still interested enough in them to watch endless hours of videos about them. There are theories about the evolution of empathy in humans that credit storytelling as being one of the key elements that helped us develop that quality. In stories, we are putting ourselves in the mind of somebody else. We're putting ourselves into their heads and going through their experiences rather than our own. So I found it very interesting that the newly sentient Murderbot's first activity was to immerse itself in storytelling. Aside from Murderbot, though, the rest of the characters in the story never seem to evolve past the depth of shadows on the wall around the light of Murderbot. Most of them blurred together in my mind and stayed generic scientist 1, generic scientist 2, or was that 1 or 3? The only 2 that stood out to me at all was the leader, Dr. Mensa, and the suspicious scientist, Dr. Garathan. Dr. Mensa was notable for her clearly strong leadership skills, as well as her delicacy in interacting with Murderbot. But again, 90% of her character came with her in relation to Murderbot. Dr. Garathan was another scientist, and he was notable in that he was extremely antagonistic towards Murderbot. We see that at first as an irritant, but as the story progresses, I think Wells does a really good job of adding nuance and layers to that. So the next thing I wanted to go over about this book would be the sci-fi fantasy elements of it. What elements of it are specific to the fact that it is speculative fiction? So to begin with, I would classify the subgenre as probably cyborg, which is fiction that features a thoroughly integrated human mechanical blend as the main character. I also could see this being an AI story, since we are so focused on exploring this new consciousness and autonomy that is in fact artificial. AI fiction tends to feature one or many artificial minds that become fully sentient. They might be mainframe computers or robots or possibly the whole internet, but basically some sort of artificial consciousness that becomes sentient. In regards to science and technology, there is some technology that is hinted at with Murderbot itself. It is some sort of construct of cloned human parts woven together with some form of artificial cybernetic parts, such that it is an amalgamation of both human and robot. But it never gets into the nitty-gritty of that, of the science behind that. You're just supposed to accept that that is a believable science. The science of it is not an important part of the story. It is about the character that is created from that process. Software plays a really important part in the story, particularly bad software. There's also a little bit of the idea of spyware. The scientists mentioned that one of the reasons they didn't want to rent the SEC unit in the first place is because they were aware that it recorded all of their conversations and actions to pass on to the company, and all of that information would later be mined for data and resold. And this is interesting in that it mirrors present day fears that we have now about the uses of technology by governing bodies and corporations to gather information about us. We never get much more than that, though, in regards to real crunchy sci-fi, other than the vague knowledge that these people are spacefaring, and that they colonize many planets. I don't think that the book has a lot in the way of themes. Again, it is a very simple and straightforward story. There is somewhat of an exploration about the edges of personhood and what it means to be an autonomous being. Where's the boundary between automaton and human? Or better yet, the boundary between automaton and sentience. But the story focuses mainly on the emotional experience of Murderbot and leaves you to form your own thoughts on the subject. There are also some psychological ideas that are touched upon in the story. Obviously, Murderbot's anxiety and anthrophobia, as it has to deal with the human beings and its emotional reaction to that. And lastly, I wanted to talk about the ending. I actually really liked the ending of the story. So this novella is in fact, just the start of a series. There are 3 more novellas that come after this one and 2 full-length novels. And I do think that the story does a great job of setting up the board for those future stories. I'm definitely looking forward to reading them. But another thing I love about the story is that it is a true ending to the story at hand. It is self-contained and satisfying, even if you never read any of the books that come after it, which is something I really appreciate in a series. So my overall conclusion for the story is that it is a highly enjoyable read, and even though there are some weaker areas that are not as filled in as I would always prefer in a story, I think that it more than makes up for it with an incredibly interesting character. And I feel like this book exceeded my expectations. I mean, I expected to enjoy it because it is a AI type story, but I think I was a little put off by the sarcastic tone and worried that it would just be a little too flippant and shallow when I found that the character actually had a lot of depth and substance to them, and I really appreciated that. I thought that the book itself was beautifully made. The cover art is gorgeous. I mean, Jamie Jones does beautiful work. If I were to try and think of some other books like it, one that immediately had come to mind to me was Ancillary Justice. When I read it, I've also heard people say that it reminds them of A Long Way to a Small and Angry Planet, but I haven't read that one yet, so that could be completely wrong. It's just something that I have heard a lot of people repeat. So who would I recommend this book to? I would probably recommend this book to anyone that wants a quick read that's going to take them away into this whole world, that's going to be a lot of fun to read. They're going to care a lot about the character. I wouldn't recommend this book to someone that is looking for a lot of deep themes, a lot of crunchy sci-fi details or world building. I think that they would be disappointed in the fact that this is more of a character study, but it is a ton of fun, makes for a really good evening of reading. I know that I will definitely be reading the rest of the books in this series, and maybe I'll even check out some of her fantasy books. You never know. All right, so when it comes to giving it a rating, I have decided to go with a 0 to 100% scale. So I'm going to go with an 80% out of 100. It was thoroughly enjoyable. Great job that Wells did in crafting this character and taking us into its own head and letting us experience its own anxieties and weaknesses. And I think that that makes up for a lot of some of the other weaker areas of the story. So that was my first Booktube book review. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope that if you have not read All Systems Red, it inspires you to go read it. If you have read it, I'd love to know if you agreed with or if you disagreed with some of my points that I made in my review. Have you read the rest of the books in this series? Let me know down in the comments below. Thanks again for watching my video, and I hope to see you guys again soon, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.